On the 1st of September, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected aces, sat in the humid operations tent on Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. His one remaining eye scanned the intelligence report in his hands, a smirk slowly forming on his lips. The Americans had produced a new fighter, the F6F Hellcat, and according to the report, it was a slow, cumbersome machine that looked more like a bomber than a fighter. It was, they claimed, twice the weight of the legendary Zero. Sakai couldn't help but laugh. For 2 years, the Zero had been the undisputed king of the Pacific skies, effortlessly shooting down everything in its path. British Hurricanes, American P-42s, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes all had fallen before the might of the Zero. Yet here was this new, overweight American fighter, which Sakai was certain would be no different from the others, another failure of design. What Sakai didn't know, what none of the pilots in that tent knew, was that in exactly 30 days, the Hellcat would begin its systematic annihilation of Japanese naval aviation. The Hellcat would go on to achieve a kill ratio of 19-1, destroying over 5,000 enemy aircraft while losing only 270 in aerial combat. It would transform carrier warfare, break the back of Japan's air power, and prove that the Zero's reign of terror had been built on a foundation of fatal assumptions. As the pilots prepared for another day of aerial combat, they couldn't see the future unfolding before them. The Hellcat, an aircraft that seemed to violate every rule they had perfected, would soon rewrite the mathematics of aerial supremacy. The stage was set. The Zero, an aircraft designed for nimbleness, would soon clash with the F6F Hellcat, a machine built on sheer strength. And in this collision, the fate of the Pacific would be decided. By the time the first Hellcats flew into combat, the American Navy had spent nearly 2 years recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor. The American military had learned from its early mistakes and understood the need for a new approach to air combat. The F6F Hellcat was the answer, designed to not only compete with Japan's fighters, but to surpass them in every way. While the Japanese pilots still relied on their exceptional skills and the superior agility of their Zero fighters, the Americans were building a new kind of fighter, a machine that relied on power, firepower, and, most importantly, teamwork. The Hellcat was heavier, slower, and less agile, but it was built to survive. The aircraft was armored, its self-sealing fuel tanks could take multiple hits, and its 6 Browning M2 machine guns could unleash a devastating amount of firepower. Its primary strength wasn't in its maneuverability but in its durability, its ability to absorb punishment, and its ability to strike back with overwhelming force. As the Hellcats made their way to the Pacific theater, the Japanese pilots, who had dominated the skies for so long, remained confident. They had weathered the storm at Pearl Harbor, shattered the British Far East Fleet, and crushed every enemy that had dared to face them in the sky. The Zero was their pride. It was fast, nimble, and capable of turning on a dime. The concept of an American aircraft built for endurance and firepower was laughable. Japan's leaders dismissed the Hellcat as another failure of American design. It was a machine that couldn't possibly compete with the agility of the Zero. However, by September of 1943, that arrogance was beginning to show cracks. The Japanese Navy had grown complacent, believing that its dominance in the skies would continue without challenge. The pilots had never faced a threat like the Hellcat before, and they were about to learn the hard way that technology and tactics could defeat skill and speed. The first major engagement between the F6F Hellcat and the Zero was set for September 30th, 1943. Over Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui, who was escorting a reconnaissance mission, would be the first to test the Hellcat in battle. On the 30th of September, 1943, Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui encountered something that would forever alter the course of the war. As his squadron of Zeros spotted 6 dark blue aircraft rising in the distance, Fukui's initial thoughts were dismissive. They were B-25 bombers, he assumed, heading for their target. But as the aircraft drew closer, he realized the unmistakable shape of the enemy fighters, the Hellcats. At first glance, Fukui thought they were simply modified bombers, something the Americans had mounted fighter guns onto. But as the battle unfolded, He quickly realized he had underestimated his adversary. He executed his familiar maneuver, a diving turn that would bring him into the tail of his enemy. This was the Zero's signature move, and it had been devastatingly effective for 2 years. But this time, the Hellcat didn't play by the rules. Instead of attempting to outrun Fukui or maneuver to escape, the American aircraft did something unprecedented. It went vertical. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney engine roared to life, sending it upwards at an astonishing rate, far outpacing the Zero's abilities. Fukui tried to follow but quickly found himself struggling to maintain his speed and altitude as the Hellcat soared higher. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat performed a hammerhead turn, a maneuver that should have been impossible for an aircraft of its weight. But the Hellcat pulled it off with ease, diving down directly onto Fukui's tail. The American fighter opened fire, unleashing a barrage of 6 machine guns. Fukui's aircraft was hit 17 times in just 3 seconds. Only by spinning into a dive did he manage to escape, though his Zero was heavily damaged. Fukui made it back to Marcus Island, but his wingman, Petty, Officer Second Class Masao, didn't. Neither did the reconnaissance plane they had been escorting. The Hellcat had claimed its first victory in the Pacific, and the Japanese pilots were beginning to feel the weight of the American machine they had so long dismissed. The Zeros, once the undisputed rulers of the skies, were facing a new enemy, one that would rewrite the rules of air combat. The Japanese were not prepared for the devastation that was about to unfold. On the 5th of October, 1943, Task Force 14 struck Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led a squadron of 12 Zeros into the skies, confident that the Americans would be easily defeated. They had the altitude, the surprise, and the momentum. Victory seemed certain, but this time, the Americans didn't scatter or break formation. The Hellcats stayed together, maintaining their positions as they dove on the Zeros, forcing them into an unfamiliar fight. Instead of trying to turn and outmaneuver their opponents, the Hellcats used their overwhelming firepower to absorb the punishment of the Zeros' attacks. With their heavy armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 6 powerful Browning M2 machine guns, the Hellcats were designed to take hits and keep fighting. The Zeros, by contrast, had no armor, no self-sealing tanks, and very little room for error. As the Zeros exhausted their ammunition and descended in their futile dives, the Hellcats climbed into the altitude where the Zeros' engines struggled to keep up. The Hellcats, with their superior engines and powerful climb rates, were now in control. The result was devastating. In the ensuing battle, 8 Zeros were shot down. No Hellcats were lost. The Japanese pilots were beginning to realize that the Hellcat wasn't just a plane, it was a system, one that operated as a unit, utilizing technology and tactics in ways they had never anticipated. The overwhelming power of the Hellcat had become a symbol of the shift in the Pacific War. The Japanese, once masters of the skies, were now facing the dawn of a new kind of aerial warfare, one that would not be defined by individual heroics, but by the efficiency and strength of an industrial war machine. By the time the Pacific War came to a close in 1945, the F6F Hellcat had become the most successful naval fighter of the war. With over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed and a kill ratio of 19-1, the Hellcat had transformed the balance of power in the Pacific. It had not only outclassed the Zero in every conceivable way, it had redefined the very nature of carrier warfare. The impact of the Hellcat was felt long after the war. It wasn't just the technological superiority of the aircraft that mattered, it was the way the Hellcat represented the industrial might of the United States. The Americans were not just building planes, they were building a system, a machine capable of overwhelming the enemy with superior firepower, coordination, and production. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter, it was a weapon of mass production, a symbol of a nation that could afford to protect its warriors while delivering victory at an unprecedented scale. The human cost for Japan was staggering. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who had entered the war, fewer than 100 remained by August of 1945. The Zero, once a symbol of Japan's air superiority, was no match for the Hellcat's relentless assault. As Japan's remaining pilots turned to desperate kamikaze missions, the Zero's legacy was forever tarnished. The Hellcat's legacy, however, was one of victory, efficiency, and transformation. It was the symbol of American ingenuity and the power of a nation that could build a system for war, one that could overwhelm the greatest fighters in the world. With the surrender of Japan on the 15th of August, 1945, the Hellcats' final aerial victory came just hours before the end of the war. The aircraft's last mission took place as the American pilot, Lieutenant Clarence Moore, intercepted a Japanese D-4 wide-duty dive bomber near the fleet. The Hellcats' guns rang out for the last time, signaling the official end of the Pacific Air War. The Hellcat had the last laugh. In the years following World War II, the F6F Hellcat continued to symbolize the triumph of American ingenuity. The aircraft's legacy went beyond just its victories in the Pacific. It became a testament to the strength of an industrial democracy and the unwavering resolve of its people. But the true weight of its impact was perhaps best captured by the voices of those who lived through the conflict, those who witnessed the destruction of Japan's once proud Air Force. In the summer of 1962, a symposium was held in the United States to reflect on the legacy of Pacific War aviation. American and Japanese veterans, now decades removed from the violence of the war, gathered together to discuss what had truly transpired in the skies over the Pacific. Among them was Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces with 34 confirmed kills. In a simple yet profound statement, McCampbell said, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable." His words were a reflection not just of the aircraft's success, but of the systems and strategies that had been built around it, systems that had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. But on the other side of the table sat Captain Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace who had survived the war despite flying in some of the most perilous missions in history. Sakai, now an elderly man, shared his perspective with a quiet reverence. "The Zero made Japan a great naval power," he said. "The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost." Those words carried a profound truth. The Japanese had fought with individual skill, with pride, and with the samurai spirit. But the Hellcat had proven that wars of the future would not be won by individual heroics alone. They would be won by systems, by a nation's ability to create and sustain industrial power and to build weapons that could outlast and outfight anything their enemies could produce. For the pilots who survived the war, the Hellcat was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. While the Zero pilots had been trained to soar as warriors, the Hellcat pilots operated as a well-oiled machine, moving in perfect coordination, guided by radar and communications that ensured no pilot ever fought alone. The Zero had been built to be nimble, to dance through the skies with grace. The Hellcat, on the other hand, was built to endure, to strike with overwhelming force, and to carry the might of an entire nation with every turn of its engine. By the end of the war, the Hellcat's dominance was undeniable. It had claimed 5,223 kills, a staggering achievement. But the true cost was measured in human terms. The Zero's pilots, once the terror of the Pacific, had become ghosts in the wind. Of the 18,000 aviators who had entered the war in 1941, fewer than 100 remained by August of 1945. Yet the legacy of the Hellcat extends far beyond the war itself. The aircraft's victory over the Zero was more than just a military success. It was a turning point in the philosophy of warfare. It proved that superior technology, when matched with coordinated tactics and an industrial system built for war, could defeat the best trained and most skilled adversaries. For the men who had flown the Hellcat, the aircraft remained a symbol of resilience and innovation. The memories of their combat victories, the fear, the bravery, and the endless battles would live on in the hearts of those who had flown it. And as the years passed, the Hellcat's presence was felt not just in the history books, but in the way the world would approach warfare in the future. In the end, the F6F Hellcat's greatest legacy wasn't just the battles it won. It was the way it helped shape the world after the war, ensuring that future generations would know what true technological superiority looked like. The Hellcat was more than just a fighter. It was a harbinger of a new age, one that would forever change the nature of combat. As veterans gathered at memorials, in reunions, and in quiet moments of reflection, they would remember the sound of the Hellcat's engines, the roar of the 6 machine guns, and the feeling of invincibility it gave them in the sky. The Hellcat had not just won the war, it had forged a new path forward for those who had fought and for the generations that would come after. And so, the story of the Hellcat continues. Not just in history, but in the hearts and minds of all who understand that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the courage of a single man, but from the power of an entire nation working in harmony. The legacy of the Hellcat, and the men who flew it, will never be forgotten. The end of World War II marked more than just the conclusion of a devastating conflict. It was the beginning of a new era in warfare, where the lessons learned from the Hellcat would resonate far beyond the Pacific skies. The industrial might that had fueled the success of the Hellcat became a symbol of America's ability to outproduce its enemies, reshaping not just the way wars were fought, but the very nature of military strategy. In the factories of the United States, the Hellcat was an industrial miracle. The Bethpage, New York factory operated around the clock, churning out a new Hellcat every 60 minutes. By the time the war ended, over 12,000 Hellcats had been built, a staggering feat of production that the Japanese could never comprehend. While Japan could only produce around 5,000 fighters in the same period, the United States was able to build 35,000 fighters in just 1 year alone. The scale of American production during the war would serve as a blueprint for future conflicts. The United States had not just built a better aircraft, it had built a system for manufacturing that would be the envy of the world. Each Hellcat that rolled off the assembly line represented not only the engineering genius of its creators, but also the power of a nation mobilized for war. The American production system was the backbone of victory, enabling the U.S. Navy to field a fleet of carriers that could strike anywhere in the world, confident that their Hellcats would dominate the skies. But the Hellcat's legacy was not just limited to its production. The aircraft's success in the Pacific War proved a crucial point to military strategists around the world. In modern warfare, technology and logistics were just as important as skill and bravery. The Hellcat represented a new era of warfare, one where air superiority was achieved not by individual pilots alone, but by the synergy of advanced technology, efficient production, and strategic planning. In the years after the war, as the world moved into the Cold War, the lessons of the Pacific War would continue to influence naval aviation. The United States, now the undisputed leader in air and sea power, continued to refine its aircraft, learning from the Hellcat's strengths and weaknesses. The next generation of fighters, like the F-8 Crusader and the F-14 Tomcat, would build upon the Hellcat's legacy of endurance, firepower, and technological innovation. The Hellcat's influence would be felt not only in the development of future aircraft, but also in the evolution of carrier warfare itself. While the Zero, with its unmatched agility and skillful pilots, had ruled the skies over the Pacific in the early years of the war, the Hellcat represented the triumph of a new philosophy, one that valued industrial strength, technological superiority, and the power of coordinated teamwork over individual brilliance. It was a stark contrast to the samurai tradition that Japan held dear, where each pilot was trained to fight alone, to rely on his own instincts and skill. The Hellcat, in its raw power and ability to endure, symbolized the shift from the age of the individual warrior to the age of the industrial war machine. For the surviving Japanese pilots, the Hellcat had become an inescapable truth. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a symbol of the New World Order, one where technology would outpace tradition. Many former Zero pilots, after the war, would reflect on the lessons they had learned too late. As they trained new generations of pilots in the post-war years, they could not escape the fact that Japan had entered the war with a mindset rooted in past glory, only to find itself overwhelmed by a future it had failed to understand. In the decades that followed, the F6F Hellcat was retired from active service, but its place in history was cemented. The Hellcat, along with the men who flew it, would be remembered not just for its victories in the skies over the Pacific, but for the way it changed the world's understanding of air combat. The Hellcat's success was a reminder that in warfare, the true test of victory was not just in the bravery of individual warriors, but in the power of systems that could adapt, evolve, and endure. The legacy of the Hellcat lives on in the principles of modern warfare. Its triumph over the Zero demonstrated that, in the end, It is not just the fighter that matters, but the system that supports it, the network of technology, logistics, and strategy that determines the outcome of any conflict. And though the Hellcat may be long gone, its impact on the world of aviation and the principles of warfare will never be forgotten.